My name is Rich Miller, and I'm with Visible Technologies, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here today. We've got a great webinar for you, and I think you'll get a lot out of this regardless of what type of role you may have in your organization. Our presenters today are two fantastic presenters with a ton of experience in this area. Our goal is to always make sure that we teach you something, so we're very, very pleased today to bring a communications expert to the table with us. More than just a communications expert, even more specific, a measuring communications expert, and that's Katie Paine. Katie's been working in communications and measurement of communications for over 20 years. Lots of really, really great tangible experience. She's written 3 just seminal books on the topic, Measuring What Matters, Measuring Public Relationships, and also Measuring the Networked Nonprofit Using Data to Change the World. And then the other thing that I thought was really fantastic is she was inducted into the PR News Measurement Hall of Fame in recent years, and I think that's testament to her expertise in this area. And then we also have from Visible, we have Michelle Vangel. Michelle has been working with social media and research companies, working for big brands around the world, trying to get insights to them from social and from other forms of research. She also has responsibility for our Insight Services department here at Visible. Those are the consultants that work at Visible around very specific business problems with our customers, and we try to solve those problems through social media analytics and social media insights. So Katie's going to talk a lot about some of the best practices in the area. Michelle is going to add a lot of color about how we've seen people work their way through some of these things using social media. So before we go any further, we do have a quick poll for everybody. It's always important for us to know who we're talking to. You should be able to go ahead and click and answer some of these questions. But what is your functional role? Are you in corporate comms? Are you in digital marketing? Are you in specific brand or product marketing? Do you work in market research? Are you a social media specialist within your company? Do you have another customer-facing role that maybe we didn't talk about above? Or are you in an operational role within your organization? So that could be like a finance or an IT. So take just a second to click on what is appropriate for you. And what we'll do is we'd like to get a feel for what kind of people are on the phone today with us and actually on the webcast also. So what it's looking like is about a third of the people are in corporate communications. The majority of the rest are scattered across marketing roles, digital marketing, brand marketing, market research. And then we do have a few people that are social specialists and some other people that are other operational people. So a good breadth of people, I think, on the call today. And I think it's safe for us to assume that we probably have different levels of expertise around communications. So we'll keep that in mind as we move forward. So without any further ado, what I am going to do is pass it over to Katie, and she is going to walk us through some of the best practices around measuring communications effectiveness. Katie?
Thank you so much, Rich, and thank everybody for being here, and thank you to my good friend Michelle for making this happen. It's a pleasure to be here. And just very quickly, if you have questions after, I know I speak quickly and I talk about a lot of things. Paine Publishing is my company and my website, and there's like lots of answers to all kinds of measurement questions. I call it the Wikipedia of measurement and measurement standards. So that's how to find me. So my general philosophy about getting and showing value from your communications today is that it really is the end of the world as we know it, or as we knew it. The whole idea that it's about media, and I know they call it social media, but it's really not media. Traditional media, social media, it really isn't about that as much anymore, because in essence, as corporate communicators, you're having direct conversations or semi-direct conversations with your customers. The companies are so much closer to the customers and have been for a number of years, but are getting increasing access through Twitter, through Facebook, through Instagram, through all of these different things. They have a million ways to talk to you. So it's really much more now not about reaching the media, but about how your communications efforts affect the business directly. It's also, there's a lot of talk about big data, but it really isn't about how big your data is. It's about how you use it. Ultimately, it's not about how loud you're shouting at people anymore. It's about the relationships that you're building. I'll talk a little bit about how you move people along the ladder of engagement to relationships. And finally, I'll touch on the standards, which I've spent a great many years working with the Institute for Public Relations, the Coalition, and now the Conclave on establishing social media standards. And the reason why we do this, and I'll speak a little bit more about this later, is really to make your lives easier and to try to institute some level of uniformity and conformity and consistency across various assorted metrics. So for starters, if you haven't read Bob Garfield's book called You Can't Buy Me Like, it's really a great sort of overview of what is going on in the media today. He's a longtime media writer, worked for Ad Age and now works for Media Post and hosts on the media for National Public Radio. And basically he calls it the relationship era. I call it the era of the bowl of nuts. Essentially, since you're all professionals, chances are you've spent some time in hotel bars. And if you've ever spent any time in a hotel bar or any kind of a bar, you'll see a bowl of nuts. And invariably, you're going to go in there and you're going to pick out the nuts that you like best, the cashews, the peanuts, whatever. And after an hour or so, you'll notice that at the bottom of the bowl are basically things that nobody particularly likes. Well, that's essentially what's happening to your communications today. People are not going to pay attention to the things that they don't like. They're going to pick and choose the things that are interesting to them. They'll eat the cashews first, the sexiest things out there, the things that are closest to their personal interests, or the things that people tell them that they really respect, tell them they have to read or consume or whatever. But basically, if you're putting content out there, you got to remember that the last thing you want to be is those horrible little brown hazelnuts at the bottom of the bowl. The other thing you got to remember is that as much as we talk a lot about social, 90% of conversation still happens offline, and most influence still happens offline. Banner ads and online ads are highly overrated. A recent study showed that 82% of them are actually ignored, which is why you see the growth of native advertising and things like that. But it's only a matter of time until those are ignored too. I mean, when banner ads first came out, they worked, and then they stopped working, and yet people still invest in them because I have no idea why. Don't ask. I really do not understand. The other thing is that if you get raw data from, whether it's from Google Alerts or one of the monitoring services or anybody else out there, chances are pretty good that about 40% of it does not belong in your data set. Whether it's Viagra ads or Facebook posts that are automatically generated by robots, or conversations generated by robots, or things that are generated by pay-per-click sites. There's just a tremendous amount of stuff out there. And the other myth out there is that you can actually measure all those conversations, because guess what? Only about 10% of all the conversations are public. Yes, you can monitor the ones what people are saying about your corporate Facebook page or your corporate Twitter handle, but most of what is on Facebook is actually private. And even Facebook will tell you that less than 10%, and Twitter will tell you it's probably less than 5%, and Ford Motor Company did research that said it was even less than that. Basically said that less than 5% of what is posted on Twitter and Facebook is actually seen. And one of the reasons for that is because digital natives, who do occupy a lot of this space, switch media every 2.2 minutes, 27 times an hour. So nobody's got the time to read everything you post, and so it really doesn't matter whether you've made a lot of impressions out there. What really matters is what they've done with it. Now, what has happened with corporate communications for years, and marketing is responsible for a lot of this, is that there have been ways, because that's where the money was, to measure the impact of print media and digital and online media buys and all kinds of other paid marketing. That's where the dollars were, therefore that's where the metrics were. And people developed various forms of marketing mix models that would attribute sales, leads, inquiries, all those things that matter to a business. They would attribute those with a reasonable degree of accuracy to something that they paid for, the ads or the direct mail or whatever it happened to be. And somewhere out there, what nobody knew was earned media. What was the contribution of earned media? In other words, traditional media, public relations, and now social media, the stuff that people work very hard to earn the coverage or earn the conversation out there. And it was just out there, and nobody really attributed any of the success to it. Today, because of data, because of the data availability, because of more sophisticated techniques, and frankly just because social and traditional media is taking more dollars, it is being incorporated into these marketing mix modeling structures. And that's where you're going to start to get the real ROI, the real return, measurable return from the efforts that you make. And I see one quick question which I'll address. Digital natives are people who have never known a time without the Internet. So pretty much anybody under the age of about 25. The conclusion of this is that social media, again, is not the media. It is your business. It is going to have an impact. But the way you're going to measure its impact is not by saying, oh, I made this many impressions or even that I got this many likes. It's going to be measuring the tangible revenue impact somewhere in your organization. And it might be a cheaper way to get a message out there. It is more likely to be a cheaper way to either, or a more effective way, not necessarily cheaper, but a more effective way to do customer service, to do product marketing research, to do product support, to do R&D, to understand what your competition is up to. It may be a better way to communicate with your employees. It may be a better way to generate sales. I don't know. It's going to be different for all the different organizations out there. But the only way you're going to really measure the impact is if you look at the impact across the organization and not just from the lens of corporate communications. So how do you do this? I have 6 steps that essentially I believe work to measure just about anything from an event to a social media campaign to almost anything else. And most people, including all the standards, pretty much follow this essential structure, which is it's got to start with a goal. The goals are, what is your program or campaign designed to achieve? Then you have to understand what the parameters are. You can measure anything given enough money, but if you are spending $100,000, you're not going to spend $100,000 to measure it. You're probably going to spend about $10,000, which puts certain restrictions on what you can actually measure. You also have to understand what people actually perceive that you as corporate communicators or public relations professionals, what do people perceive you to be responsible for? That is a critical question that has to be established in step 2 when you're trying to figure out who you're trying to reach, how do your efforts connect with the audiences, and how do you actually start to move the needle? What's the expectation? And one of the best moments, 2 best moments I'll give you as an example is one was I walked into a major defense firm and I was responsible for showing PR's impact on the business. And I met with the guy who was putting together the dashboard for the whole company, and I said, so walk me back from how you believe PR actually generates leads or sales for this major defense company. He goes, I don't expect PR to generate sales. I mean, nobody's ever going to buy a missile system based on a press release. What I want to know is you are advancing our strategic reputational initiatives, and you're getting our messages out there. And I said, oh, well, that makes life simple. That I can measure. That's easy. And then the second one was for a major travel company. And I asked the head of strategy, I said, so what role do you think PR and social media plays? And he goes, well, they start the ball rolling. Basically, they are the spark that starts people along the path to a visit. And I said, oh, great. That tells me what the parameters are, what people expect me to do. Then from there, you need a benchmark because measurement is a comparison tool. Then and only then do you actually get around to defining the metrics by which you're going to measure these things, the specific percentages or dollars or whatever it is that you're going to actually put on that dashboard. Step 5 is selecting a tool, and 6 is analyzing data. And the reason the tool is the second to last thing you should be looking at is if you haven't already identified all those things that I mentioned in steps 1 through 5, you're wasting, poor Michelle's time, my time, everybody's time out there, including your own, in trying to figure out a tool unless you know what that tool is supposed to measure. And I tell the sad story of a company that I spent all day long with finally identifying that what they wanted to measure was employee engagement. And they said, well, we just invested $80,000 in this tool, and will that do that? And I said, well, sadly, no, it won't. It'll do a great job of collecting your clips, but it's not going to measure employee engagement for you. So you really want to get all of your ducks in a row. And then finally, step 6 is getting insight from all of that data. And I'll talk a little bit about how to do that. And Karen, I will answer your question. I just saw it in the chat. CI is competitive intelligence. IR is investor relations. And they're aspects that social media does have an impact on. How do you figure out what your goal is? You ask yourself, why are you doing what you're doing? Again, it goes back to that question that I asked the senior strategist. What is it that communications can affect that you expect us to do? What is communications here for? Chances are pretty good that your answer will fall into one of two buckets. It's either going to be some kind of intermediary effect, like raising awareness or knowledge or education or understanding, or perhaps it is a tangible outcome like revenue, cost savings, leads, advocacy, recommendations, or some form of tangible engagement. When you've got that goal defined, then the measurement process becomes very simple. You have the goal. You know that you're going to take some action to achieve that goal. You're then going to have some level of activity that you need to measure to make sure that activity is happening. But ultimately, the outcome metric is going to be reflective of the goal. So if your goal is to increase your marketable universe, you have a major media event with social media and all kinds of other things, you're going to see whether you've got your messages out there maybe or count the level of engagement. But ultimately, you're going to need to go back and measure the percent increase in your marketable universe. That's what that metric would be. And same thing with preference. If you want to increase preference, you can do all these things. You can count the stuff that you're doing, but ultimately you're going to have to ask people whether they have more or less favorable perceptions and awareness. The next phase is really a little bit talking about this concept of big data and all the data is out there, and I'm going to try and dispel a few myths. This study from Market Sentinel was done a number of years ago, but what they set out to do was to figure out, of all the celebrity fans out there, how many can you really count on to have a conversation with? And they were just using celebrities because it was relatively easy to calculate, but what they did was they calculated core fans, which are people who actively engage in a conversation, either favorite or comment or retweet or do something. And they found out that of Eminem's 41 million fans, only 575 actually participated in the conversation. Now, if you do these calculations around your own core fans, my guess is the fact that you'll probably come somewhere around at 1%. That's not bad. What you need to know is are you improving over time? So this whole notion that just because you've got a lot of fans out there or you've got a high cloud score does not necessarily mean that someone is influential or that you are influencing anything. So it really is much more complex than that. A computer cannot just spit an answer out of you and say, oh, this is somebody you need to pay attention to. You need to make sure that that person is both relevant, frequently talks about your company or your organization or your marketplace, and also has reach. And then in terms of moving people along the ladder of engagement, you've got to think about it from the perspective of real human relationships. And, if you sit there and say, okay, well, the goal is, to get married and live happily ever after and have a family, right? It's probably not going to start with somebody whistling at you at a construction site. And that's what impressions are like. Impressions are just like, people whistling at you from a construction site. Match.com and things like that are like likes and follows, right? It's an expression of interest. It's a wink on Match.com. It is not a relationship. All it is an expression of interest, but you don't really know who that person is. I mean, if this were Match.com, it could be your weird cousin Ralph who lives in the basement with his boa constrictor and his parents. Not somebody you want to date. You got to figure out if it's somebody you want to date by giving them something more, by having them either subscribe to a newsletter or download a white paper or do something where they try, they consider, they express interest, perhaps by giving you their email address, and you're moving them along that path to purchase. They might actually purchase something, but it doesn't end there. That's like saying, walking down the aisle is the easiest part of the getting married. We know that it takes work on a relationship. So what you want to do is you want to move that person from the wedding day all the way through to grandparents and children and having the entire, the whole family be engaged in advocating for your brand. So you want to move them along from likes and follows towards advocacy. And why do you want to do this? It's because it's cheaper. It's basically a lot cheaper to generate advocacy and fans on social media than it is in other ways. If you look at, Zappos versus Citibank, Zappos has, 1.1 million references. Citibank has 21,000 references to I love the brand, right? The interesting thing is Citibank spends 100 times more a year than Zappos does. And from a political standpoint, Obama's campaign was the sort of seminal moment because he spent less than anybody ever to get elected. Essentially, the cost per electoral vote acquired for him was $6,000 versus almost 2.4 for Romney and $147,000 for Clinton. That's because they worked on the relationship aspect of it. And then in terms of, what do you do with the data when you have it, you've got to compare it. For years and years and years, I would say to people, you've got to rank everything on a tell us who, what failed and what succeeded. Well, in organizations, nothing really fails. Some things don't do as well as other things. And so what you want to do is you want to rank order. You've come to this agreement on what your metric is. You're going to look at all the programs based on that metric. And you're going to rank everything from best to worst. And then you're going to say, so what? So what of this thing is at the bottom of the success ladder here? So what does it matter, right? How important is it to the organization? Do I need to invest more in it? Or should we just can it, move on, and try something else? You need to keep asking that so what question in order to get to your insight, to the now what point. And then you've got to put it into a framework that meets sort of the norms of your organization. And then, let's see, did I lose something here? Was that me or you? Anyway, you need to move it into the parts of the organization so it aligns with that. So let's talk briefly about the standards. The standards started in about 2010 with the Barcelona principles. And it was a group of associations, PRSA, the Global Alliance, Institute for Public Relations, AMAC, a bunch of different PR associations got together and said, let's establish some principles of research, and here they are. Right? Number 1, importance of goal setting. Number 5, add value equivalency, which has now basically been rejected by everybody, but that in 2010 was the first time that was said. Social media can and should be measured. Transparency and replicability are important. So, setting goals, rejecting bad metrics, and being transparent, those are the principles that came out of Barcelona. After that, in response to number 6 there about social media, a bunch of people said, well, let's get together and set social media measurement standards. And at the time, I happened to be talking to the Digital Analytics Association and WOMA and a bunch of other people who were also in the process of setting standards. So I collected a whole bunch of people. We called ourselves the Conclave because we didn't have a better name. And essentially it is representatives from Procter & Gamble and Southwest Airlines, SAS, Ford Motor Company, and a bunch of agencies and a bunch of associations who have all basically come together and formed social media measurement standards. And they are, right? So there's content sourcing and methods, reach and impressions, engagement, influence and relevance, opinion and advocacy. And like I said, I'm not going to go through too much detail. I want to sort of give you the overview. The content standard is basically there's a transparency table that we encourage everybody to go to download it and use it if you are selecting a vendor or talking to vendors. Southwest Airlines is now using it for every single measurement project, research project that they do, because it basically gets the same answers from all the different vendors that they're talking to. And it defines, the content standard basically defines the language you should use around the collection of data. There's an example of the transparency table. It's actually morphed into something more elaborate these days. Most people have used it as a questionnaire, but there it is. For reach, a lot of this comes out of the traditional media piece in terms of what should and should not be counted. Impressions do not equal awareness. Multipliers should never be used. The most important thing is to remember, especially in social, that you can't that the terms are different for each social medium. Therefore, you have to be very clear as to how and what you are measuring. So, for instance, for Facebook, you can count likes. For Twitter, you can count followers, but you should not count followers of followers. In other words, you should not use that's sort of a false multiplier that nobody thinks is real. Engagement is basically going to be dependent. How you measure engagement is going to be dependent upon how you set your goals, right? So if you're new to an industry and you're just trying to get anything, likes might be just fine. But if you're UNICEF and you're really looking for a deeper level of engagement, you're going to want quality comments and a higher quality of engagement. So to a certain extent, it is response to content, but it is also going to be based on your goals for the program. For influence and relevance, I discussed this a little bit before in terms of what it's not. What it is the act of persuading somebody to change behavior or opinion. It may be an outlet, it might be an individual, it may be offline, it may be online, but it's got to have, whoever's going to be influential has to have reach, engagement, relevance, and frequency. And if it doesn't have those characteristics, it really isn't influential. The audience impact piece should be determined by some level of survey research to figure out whether, in fact, this medium, this channel, this person, or whatever has the capacity of having influence on your key stakeholders. For standards, the tone sentiment standard is basically that automated tone is generally not recommended for broad assumptions. It is good for the right place at the right time. So for instance, it definitely correlates in stock price, in movies, in books. It may not be so good for universities or for B2B. You really need to look for other things other than just pure tone and sentiment. And I think Michelle can have some good examples here of the other kinds of things that should be looked at.
So, Katie, I think you're right, and there's definitely pros and cons to using sentiment as with a broad brush. And we like to advise our clients that it's a good indicator for top-line trends and so forth. But there's definitely other measures that we can apply that tend to be much more meaningful in terms of looking at attitudes and behaviors and understanding how you're actually impacting perceptions and opinions, advocacy, people who are moving within the purchase funnel, and kind of what are the triggers that push them from one place to another. So really tying back to what our clients' key questions and objectives are, but really looking at the specifics of how we're actually being able to determine someone's overall perception and kind of looking a bit deeper. And kind of going back to where you were around kind of choosing a tool, I think even more importantly, it's choosing a partner, a solution that can really integrate some of the technology, but also some of the expertise and guidance around how to get to some of those more meaningful questions and answers. So definitely there are easy ways to get to some of those, and using some of the technological pieces. For example, Visible uses what we call categories to get to some of those attitudes and behaviors, and a lot of those are pre-built and available to all of our clients right within a platform.
Well, and I think if you think about, if you look at what we say in terms of things like intended action versus, happy birthday, Serena Williams. This is sort of my UNICEF example, but it was like, there's like a positive, happy day, I love UNICEF, but that's not really going to say I'm going to donate to UNICEF or I'm going to support their efforts in the Congo or in Syria. There's a big difference between sort of a casual expression that and the kinds of complex emotions that you guys can detect and that most companies are really interested in.
Exactly, right.
So, and then finally, the impact and value piece, and this is something that I know Michelle and I want to talk a lot more about, is that the impact and value, when you're sitting there saying, okay, let's go back to, and it's funny, I had just, before I got on this call, I got an email from somebody saying, we say in the Barcelona principles that you can't use AVE, but what's the accepted alternative? Well, the reality is that nobody ever paid money with the idea of for something with the especially not something negative or that didn't contain a key message, but the idea that advertising value equivalency or somebody would put a value on a column inch, it just, to me is baffling, because what people invest money in is something that's going to benefit the business, and you're either going to look at it from the perspective of I'm doing something cheaper. There's a cost-benefit analysis here that says that by investing in social, I'm getting more bang for the buck. I'm getting more messages out there for less money, or it's faster, because time is, of course, money, but you need to look at your objectives. And that's where it all starts. And you say, okay, well, the purpose of this program is, as I said before, to increase the marketable universe. Well, your return might be that, as we saw with the Obama example, I've increased my marketable universe, or I've gotten more votes for less money than doing it a traditional way. That's how people are really, truly showing impact and value. ROI is a strict accounting definition, and that's the way it should be used. I would strongly advocate for using other types of financial return calculations like cost-benefit or cost-benefit comparisons, or cost-effectiveness or cost efficiency. But the idea is to integrate your program into your business goals. Wouldn't you agree, Michelle?
I would, and I'd also add that it's really important to understand the impact on your target, so tying back to your objectives and who you're trying to reach. So shooting an arrow into a haystack can be, your objective in some cases, but most of the clients that we are working with have a much more specific target in terms of who they're trying to speak to, and who their messaging is geared towards. So being able to evaluate your success within that target is I think, really important.
Yeah, I think the other thing is the other piece of this is avoided negative returns. And I used the example, I was working with a consumer paper goods manufacturer, and it was in the days of the occupation of the Capitol, I believe, in Wisconsin. Very, very highly charged political atmosphere. And one of the local legislatures had discovered that this company was owned by a very right-wing conservative organization. And she basically introduced legislation that said, I think we should boycott all the products from this particular company and not allow them in the State House, and it was impact a bill and blah, blah, blah. And before the company was even really aware of this whole controversy and before they'd had a chance to do anything, there were 75 supporting tweets and posts on Facebook saying, if you do that, we will impeach you because this company is providing us jobs. And it is the only jobs these are the only jobs in the area, and this is important, and we're feeding our family, and don't you dare mess with this company. Now, you can't possibly anticipate these kinds of things, but the point was they had an active social media campaign on Facebook. They had a place for people to express these opinions, and literally their own lawyers, their own risk mitigation team said afterwards, that saved us tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, because we didn't have to, get into that battle. So I think you have to think in terms of cost avoidance as well as positive returns in some of these cases.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
So that's it for my sort of observations, but I'd love to hear your questions, and I know that Rich is going to talk about these things, and Michelle, I don't know if you want to jump into with a few more of your thoughts.
So no, I think one thing I would add is, and I think you're seeing this more and more as well, is that analysis of any medium, we're seeing more and more that our clients are moving away from doing that in a silo, or in a siloed approach, or looking at social in a vacuum, but really being able to look at integrated data. So not just social, traditional media, but also own data, private data, your own data that you may have access to. So whether that's surveys, call center data, it might be syndicated data that you subscribe to, being able to look at the whole gamut of data and being able to analyze in one place is really important, to be able to see where messages and results are actually aligning and where they differ and how one channel impacts another. So I think in terms of what we're seeing in terms of trends with our clients is that more and more are asking us to work with other research vendors that they're working with in terms of aligning and integrating data sets, and then our own capabilities of not just looking at social, but looking at offline digitized media from a very regional basis, but also, as I said, the private data that our clients have access to, which we also can analyze as well. And what we're seeing is just that they're able to really, connect the dots and glean much more meaningful insights. So as an example, we work with one large technology company where we're kind of looking at the whole spectrum of data to understand how their communications efforts are actually delivering results. So that might include internal employee comments and blogs and discussion boards that we're analyzing as well. Also from employee meetings, analyst coverage, partner channel survey results, all of these different stakeholders within the communications functions, who they're speaking to, and being able to integrate all of that data together. And I know you and I have talked about this, and you're seeing the same, that just looking at one medium unto itself and trying to really glean insights is getting to be less and less the case.
Right. I mean, you've got to look at. I mean, for literally, as soon as I get off the phone, I'm going to start doing some correlations on media coverage to figure out the impact, the degree to which media coverage drives downloads of what. There's a guide that everybody agrees is kind of the first indicator of intent to purchase. And I said, well, fine. So now let's look and see which type of media efforts are having the greatest impact on the downloads of that guide. And then we're also looking over the same time frame at some survey research that would be reflected in a consumer brand survey to basically say to what extent you agree or disagree with these statements. And in the past, what we found, interestingly enough, is that there was a much closer correlation with the earned media piece than there was with the paid media piece, which, it doesn't say that you drop your paid media. It just says in certain markets and with certain stakeholders, the earned media efforts are in fact more successful and certainly more cost-effective than some of your paid media. That doesn't say dump all of your paid media, but it says redirect that towards someplace where it is more needed, where maybe the media, the earned media, just isn't going to be there. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think that's one example of integration. I think the other example of integration is the tight connection between some inbound marketing efforts and media coverage. And I know that for one of my clients, essentially what they were doing was isolating the impact of very specific campaigns on this, growth of the marketable universe number. And when they integrated and showed everybody the dashboard, and everybody was like, "Oh, well, that doesn't account for our inbound, marketing, our telemarketing efforts, or our this efforts or that efforts," it opens up a conversation so that PR and inbound marketing and digital marketing and advertising and everybody was at the table. And they said, okay, well, so let's look at this by time and figure out whether in a certain time frame where we didn't have any paid media out there, let's see what happened. And again, it allowed them to have a much better insight in terms of what was actually driving the expansion of the marketable universe, and PR got the credit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's really fascinating, and it's really several of our clients. We're working with the brand tracking team to really integrate our results with theirs and be able to connect the dots and quickly kind of answer the questions that come up from the traditional research, which typically is more expensive, takes longer, and is working with smaller samples. So I think the social has a role there in terms of really being able to help formulate the big picture and understand what are the things that can be learned that we can quickly apply to tactical and strategic plans and really make a difference in the outcome. So that's fun stuff, and really being able to kind of integrate all of those different data sources, which I said, it's really interesting to be able to look at, where the story's hitting. Is it hitting in traditional media? How is it actually amplified in social? What is the impact of that in terms of the shift on and perceptions among key audiences? Like really being able to go beyond the overall share of voice chart and the overall blunt sentiment tool to get into, what are the mindsets and what are the unmet needs and pain points of those that you're trying to reach to really help you, kind of refine your strategy.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that discussion. Appreciate it. I do want to make sure we have a couple of minutes here to get to some of the Q&A. Again, if anybody does have any questions for Katie or Michelle, please use the chat window within ReadyTalk to submit your questions. Before we do skip to the Q&A, most of you had seen this already, but I just want to make sure for those of you that did not, we do have a final poll question in there. It's always interesting for us to know where people are coming out of the webcast. And the question was, when it comes to communications, what's your priority moving forward? Are you working on goal definition, understanding the parameters and motivators, defining the benchmarks, defining the metrics, picking a measurement tool, or really working on finding insight and planning for action? So I'm going to show you how everybody came up on that. So we had 3 winners there, 3 top steps: defining the benchmarks, defining the metrics, and then moving into finding insight and finding a plan for, or setting a plan for action, our biggest categories with the most attention that will be paid in the next 6 months. So a couple of questions came in, and I do want to make sure I have some time here to pose it to both Katie and Michelle. One of the questions that came in was, you did talk a little bit about investment as you think about not only investing in a tool to help you support the measurement, but also thinking about the bodies that you're putting into measurement. How should people think about how much should they put into the measurement effort? So hypothetically, if somebody's spending $1 million a year on corporate communications and PR and the rest of their communication activities, like what feels like a good number in terms of the amount of investment around the measuring of what is actually effective? You have any thoughts on that?
Me? Here's what my thought is always that if you spend 100% of your budget on talking at people and on generating all this stuff, you don't know whether any of it's effective. So what you have to kind of decide is, what's the right ratio? 90% yakking at people and 10% listening, 80% shouting out your words and 20% finding out whether they're worth it or not. This is an internal conversation to have about what is the right ratio. I think that it isn't, it's not an absolute that, you need to budget $50,000 for measurement. I think it is a percentage of your budget based on, how important you think it is to get feedback and understand what your customers are saying, what the media is saying about you, what's being said out there by influencers or investors or anybody else.
Great. Michelle, any thoughts at all to that, whether it be from a process standpoint or amount of investment, the right kind of ratio for paying attention to listening and reacting?
So I would say, based on our client engagements, it's a really flexible and scalable model in terms of the one that we use. So basically, some clients engage with us as an extension of their team. So basically, we're able to react really quickly and help them with everything soup to nuts in terms of helping them to define their goals and objectives, helping them to establish the metrics that map to those goals, and the final deliverables in terms of delivering insights and everything in between. So basically, we have some that outsource everything entirely. They're too busy. They don't have the headcount to actually do much except at the very beginning and end stages. And then we have many who are at various levels in between. So I think it really depends on each individual circumstance and situation. So one-on-one, I'd be happy to have that conversation, but I think more info is needed on the company structure and budget and things like that.
Great. Well, maybe if anybody does have any, if you want to go deeper on that question and you have some thoughts around maybe how dynamic your market is and how your organization is structured and things like that, and you want to follow up with either Katie or Michelle and ask that question a little bit more specifically, we'd be more than happy to get back to you on that. The other question that we had that came up is, Katie, you had mentioned at the very beginning, I think you had it was the travel company that had said really the goal in broad communications is to fill up the top part of the funnel, to get people to reach out to us in some way, shape, or form, I think is how you would put it, at least paraphrasing a little bit. But
basically,
go ahead.
Somebody has to start the spark to get people to think about this.
Okay.
And that's really what it is.
So tactically, even in our business, we hear a lot about connecting PR and broad communications to revenue. And just very tactically, there was a question that came up, how do you make that happen? So, I put my message out there, then I use a listening tool to identify those influencers, but how do I get to the point that I'm actually connecting the dots to be able to say, this thing had this type of impact, whatever that impact is.
Okay, the easiest way to do the absolutely easiest way to do that is using a unique URL. So if you have a campaign that drives people to a website, you have a unique URL for that particular website, and you say, okay, this campaign, this push out there, whatever, led people back to this website. And that's by far the easiest way of doing it. The second way is to develop some other kind of a proxy. So with a travel company, it's basically downloading the travel guide, right? So we all sat around a room. We said, okay, how do you know that somebody is likely to come visit? Because this is a province in Canada. This isn't, and it's a country of, you can't. It's not like booking a hotel room. So they said, well, we're pretty much sure that once they've downloaded the guide, they've at least expressed an interest. That's an acceptable proxy. So then we run correlations between the media results and the traffic, the downloads. We do date-time correlations with the downloads of the visitor guide relative to the various assorted PR initiatives, and define which ones are more effective than others.
Great.
So that's, and then finally you can always ask them, and that's one of the beauties of working with, people in Canada where they do a ton of research, but they do actually ask people, what made you decide to visit Canada? So they have backup data from their survey research that does that as well.
Okay, great. Michelle, any thoughts on that about tactical ways of connecting messaging through to whatever critical metric?
Well, so I think we can often pick that up from someone's social discussion, like the context of the actual post that they are doing. But in terms of the actual quantitative metric, I think in terms of what Katie was talking about, some sort of an action that you're prompting them to make. So whether that's, tweeting something in particular, having them click on and download information, creating the URL. But just in terms of the message resonance and understanding if it's resonating with particular people, that is something that we often do, and just use the linguistic strategies to pick up on that conversation with particular audience sets.
Great. Fantastic. Well, those are the questions that we had come in at the very end. So I think we've done a great job of answering some of the questions that have been coming in throughout the webcast. I'd like to thank everybody that is on the webcast for joining us today. Like I said, our goal is always that you learn something by coming to these, and hopefully, I certainly believe that Michelle and Katie have done a wonderful job of explaining some very tactical things that everybody should be able to think about as they go back to their jobs today, whether directly involved in corporate communications or involved in communications in any way through a brand marketing or product marketing role. Hopefully everybody was able to learn something. I'd like to thank Michelle and Katie, obviously, for their time and their effort putting this webcast together. We will be sending out a recording and also the deck to everybody, and that'll happen within the next 24 hours. And then finally, if you do want to reach out to any of us, there are a couple of pieces of contact information here. Should you want to talk to Michelle, you can do at @mvangelic. And then should you wish to talk to me, I'm more than happy that you send me an email message. For more information about Visible, you can go send us an email to info@visibletechnologies.com, @Visible on Twitter. If you'd like to get a demo request and see how social listening actually supports some of these measurement principles that Katie has put out there today, we'd love to have the opportunity to show you how all that becomes real through social listening. And you can find that demo request on our website, which is www.visibletechnologies.com. So we are going to wrap it up. I hope everybody has a great day and a great rest of the week, and thank you again for joining us today. Bye-bye.